Mother's Day that year began like any other Sunday. I was 66, living alone in the suburban house my husband and I had bought years before, and I had already spent the morning doing the ordinary things that make a quiet weekend feel familiar: coffee, the newspaper, watering the plants along the back porch. Then Claire called. My daughter had always been thoughtful about Mother's Day. Even after she became a mother herself, she still found some small way to make me feel remembered. That morning, she sounded cheerful, almost secretive. She told me she had sent something to the house and asked me not to open it until she arrived. I laughed and agreed. About an hour later, a delivery driver left a small brown box on my front porch. The label had my name on it, and beneath the address was a handwritten note: "For Mom, with love, Claire." I recognized her handwriting immediately. That was what made the next few minutes so unsettling. I carried the box inside and placed it on the kitchen table. I remember standing there for a moment, looking at it. There was nothing threatening about it. No strange smell, no warning label, just an ordinary package from my daughter. But I had spent more than 30 decades working in financial fraud investigations, and my job had taught me one simple habit: when something does not make sense, do not explain it away before you understand it. The tape on the box looked slightly disturbed. I took a pair of scissors and cut through the first strip. A tiny amount of white powder slipped from the seam and landed on the table. I stopped. I did not touch it. I did not brush it away. I did not open the box any further. Instead, I stepped back and called 911. I did not call Claire. That decision became important later. The police arrived quickly. They secured the kitchen, photographed the package, and treated the box as potential evidence. I stayed where they told me to stay and answered their questions as clearly as I could. Then Claire arrived. What struck me was not that she came quickly. A daughter rushing to her mother's house after hearing about a suspicious package would have been completely normal. It was what she asked when she walked through the door. She did not ask whether I was all right. She asked whether I had opened the box. I watched her face change almost immediately, as if she realized she had revealed something she hadn't meant to reveal. She tried to soften the question, asking whether I had touched anything. By then, I was paying attention to everything. The investigators opened the package under controlled conditions. The powder on the outside turned out to be harmless, but what they found inside was not. There was roughly 1.6 pounds of fentanyl. There was also a handwritten ledger, several pages of transaction notes, initials I did not recognize, shipping information, and documents containing what appeared to be my name and a signature resembling mine. The little Mother's Day package had suddenly become something far more serious. I was not arrested. No one told me I was guilty. The investigators treated me as the person who had received the package and potentially as someone who might know how it got there. They collected the box, the packaging, the documents, and anything that could later establish who had handled or shipped it. One investigator told me they would need to ask me more questions. I understood. I had spent years watching innocent people make mistakes because they were frightened and started talking before they understood what investigators actually knew. So I answered carefully, truthfully, and without trying to fill the silence. Claire stayed beside me. She looked frightened. She looked like a daughter worried about her mother. For a few minutes, I wanted to believe that was all it was. Then Claire began talking to the investigators. She mentioned that I had been under stress lately. A little later, she mentioned that I had experienced some memory problems. She said it gently, almost apologetically, as though she hated bringing it up. I looked at her. She would not look back. That was the moment something changed for me. Not because I suddenly knew everything. I did not. I did not know who put the fentanyl in that box. I did not know who created those documents. I did not know why my daughter was talking about my memory, but I understood one thing. The package was not the only thing Claire had prepared that morning. She had already prepared a story about me, and for the first time in my life, I wondered whether the person standing beside me was trying to protect me from something or quietly preparing the world to stop believing me. The police stayed for another 20 minutes after that, collecting the package and asking me the same basic questions in slightly different ways. When they finally left, the house became strangely quiet. Claire stayed behind. She picked up my car keys from the counter and slipped them into her purse. Then she started moving through the kitchen, checking my medication, looking at the calendar, asking whether I had eaten. But Claire was not simply worried. She was taking control. She told me I should not drive for a while. She offered to handle my bank calls. She said she could speak to my doctor because I had already been under too much stress. She even started making notes about appointments I had not asked her to arrange. I watched her do all of this without arguing. Then I asked one question. When did you start making decisions for me? Claire looked surprised. She said she was only trying to help. That was the first moment I understood that the package on my kitchen table might not have been the beginning of this story. It might have been the part they expected me to notice. Ryan arrived later that afternoon. My son-in-law walked into my house carrying a thin folder, a business card from a doctor, and several pages that looked like medical records. He told me I should have an evaluation. I asked what the evaluation was for. Claire answered before he could. Memory issues. Not because I had forgotten something. I hadn't. I knew exactly where I was, what had happened that morning, and why the police had been in my kitchen. What bothered me was how quickly they had moved from a package containing fentanyl to questioning my ability to make decisions. The appointment was already scheduled for Thursday with Dr. Helen Brooks, a neurologist Claire said she trusted. Claire called it a simple evaluation. I did not. Ryan already had the paperwork. Claire already had a doctor. They already had a language for describing me: stressed, forgetful, overwhelmed. I had spent most of my career investigating financial fraud, so I knew better than to focus only on what people said. I looked at what they had prepared. I did not break into anything. I did not search private accounts. I simply looked at documents Claire had left in plain sight on my dining room table. One heading caught my attention: temporary conservatorship. I read it twice. If someone convinced a court that I could no longer manage my own affairs, another person could potentially gain control over important financial decisions. This was no longer just about a medical appointment. Then I remembered the ledger inside the box. There was an entry beside the initials MW. The initials were written in the same abbreviated style I had seen in an old business file connected to my name. I checked the account number listed beside them. It was not mine. That detail mattered. A genuine financial record does not become genuine because someone puts your initials beside a number. Whoever created that ledger had built something that looked like evidence. They were constructing a story, and that story seemed to require me to be confused, careless, and eventually incapable of speaking for myself. That night, Claire tested that story without realizing I was listening carefully. She asked whether I remembered where I had been the previous Tuesday. I knew exactly where I had been. I had been at the grocery store, then the pharmacy, then home before 6. For a second, I considered giving her the answer she seemed to be waiting for. I could have said I didn't remember. I could have played the confused woman they apparently needed me to become. But I didn't. I simply asked, why? Claire had no answer. She looked away, and that silence told me more than an explanation would have. I did not confront her. I did not call the police again. I did not accuse Ryan of anything. I had learned something during my years investigating fraud.
When people are building a false story, pressure often makes them abandon it. Give them enough room and they start adding details on their own. So I decided to give them room. That night, after Claire and Ryan were gone, I opened an old wooden box I had not touched in years. Inside were photographs, work documents, and business cards from people I hadn't spoken to since before my husband died. Near the bottom was one card I remembered immediately: Elliot Grant. He had been one of the sharpest people I had ever worked with. I held the card for a moment before dialing the number. When he answered, I did not explain everything. I only said, "Elliot, I need you to investigate my family." And for the first time since that box arrived, I felt I had made one decision entirely on my own.
The next morning, I met Elliot Grant at a small diner about 15 minutes from my house. We had worked together years earlier, back when I was still investigating financial fraud full-time. Elliot had been the attorney people called when a complicated case needed someone patient enough to follow every transaction and stubborn enough not to accept the first explanation. He arrived with a notebook, ordered coffee, and listened. I told him about the box, the fentanyl, the ledger, the strange documents, and the way Claire had started talking about my memory almost before the police had finished processing the evidence. I also told him about the conservatorship paperwork I had seen. I expected him to reassure me. He didn't. Instead, he started asking questions. Who had sent the package? Who had known it was coming? Who had called me before it arrived? Who knew about the doctor's appointment? Who would benefit if a court decided I could no longer manage my own affairs? The questions were simple, but together they changed the shape of what had happened. I told him I didn't want revenge. I wanted to know what was happening before someone else's version of events became the official one. Elliot looked at me for a moment and said, "Then we don't investigate what they say. We investigate what they need." That became the rule we followed. We did not break into anyone's accounts. We did not threaten Claire or Ryan. We did not invent evidence. We worked from records I was entitled to have, information already available through legitimate channels, and documents that could be independently verified. The first person we looked at was Ryan. On the surface, my son-in-law had always appeared comfortable. He was a real estate broker, drove a newer SUV, wore expensive watches, and never seemed worried about money. The records told a different story. There were personal loans, several revolving credit lines, unusual transfers, and a pattern of online sports betting transactions that became more frequent over the previous year. Then Elliot found something that made the rest of it make sense. Ryan was carrying roughly $2.4 million in debt. It wasn't one enormous loan. It was a collection of obligations that had grown until the numbers no longer looked manageable. Some payments were overdue. Some accounts had been extended repeatedly. There were transactions connected to offshore gambling platforms, and there were messages from people demanding payment before the end of the month. I remember sitting across from Elliot and staring at that number, $2.4 million. For the first time, the strange package in my kitchen had a possible motive behind it. Ryan did not simply want money. He needed money quickly. But there was something else. Claire knew. Elliot found records showing that she had co-signed 2 of Ryan's loans. She had also transferred money to him repeatedly, and part of her expected inheritance had already been used as financial security. I had spent years believing that Claire might make mistakes because she trusted the wrong people. This was different. She had signed documents. She had moved money. She had become financially involved in Ryan's problem. I remember asking Elliot the question I had been trying not to ask myself. She knew? He looked down at the documents before answering. She didn't just know, she signed. I did not speak for a while. I wanted another explanation.
I wanted to believe Claire had been frightened, manipulated, or pressured. I wanted to believe somewhere underneath all of this, she was still trying to protect her family. So I said that maybe she thought she was helping Ryan. Elliot did not argue with me. He simply reminded me of the evidence we had already seen. People do desperate things when they are afraid of losing everything. But desperate did not explain why my name appeared on narcotics records I'd never seen, or why a package containing fentanyl was sent to my home. And then Elliot found another transaction. This one came from Claire's account. It had moved through an entity that appeared to have no ordinary business purpose. The company was registered offshore, and the ownership trail was complicated enough to hide the person benefiting from it. The amount transferred through the structure was approximately $684,000. I stared at the figure. That was the moment my understanding of Claire changed. Until then, I had been thinking about Ryan as the person driving the scheme, and Claire as the daughter who had been pulled into it. Now I had to consider something harder. Claire might not simply be afraid of Ryan's debts. She might be preparing for the moment when I could no longer control my own money. That realization hurt more than the $2.4 million ever could. Because debt could explain Ryan, fear could explain Claire, but $684,000 meant someone had been planning.
The next morning, Elliot and I went back to the records connected to the $684,000 transfer. I had spent the night trying to convince myself that the money could have another explanation. By then, I knew better than to build conclusions around what I wanted to be true. The transfer did not lead directly to Claire. It led to a small offshore LLC with no employees, no real office, and no clear business activity. On paper, it looked like a company. In practice, there was very little there. Claire was not listed as the direct owner, but the records Elliot obtained showed that she was an indirect beneficiary. That distinction mattered. It meant she had not simply moved money into an account with her own name on it. Someone had taken deliberate steps to place distance between Claire and the money. I kept thinking about the questions she had asked me over the previous year. One afternoon, while we were standing in my kitchen, she had casually asked what would happen to the house if something happened to me. At the time, I thought it was normal. Claire was a mother herself. She had started thinking about wills, insurance, and what she would leave her own children. Now I heard that conversation differently. She had not asked me what I wanted. She had asked what would happen to my property. Elliot also found records showing that Claire had previously accessed documents she was legitimately allowed to see. There was nothing illegal about that access. She had copies of my will, insurance information, property estimates, and investment summaries, because I had trusted her enough to share them. That trust suddenly looked different when I placed the dates beside the other records. She had been learning what I owned months before the package arrived. And the hardest part was that I had already planned to leave most of it to her. My existing estate plan would have given Claire roughly $5.9 million. She would also have received the house, certain investments, and other assets. I had even set aside money intended to support my grandchildren's education. I had thought I was building her future. I had never imagined she might start trying to collect that future while I was still standing in my own kitchen. That was where the story became more complicated for me. I did not believe Claire had woken up one morning and decided she wanted to destroy my mother. People rarely tell themselves that kind of truth. They find softer words. She could have told herself that I was getting older. She could have convinced herself that managing my money for me was protection, not theft. Ryan could have reinforced that idea every time he reminded her that his debts were growing and their family's future was at risk.
There was a difference between planning for a parent's eventual estate and trying to control the parent before that estate existed. Somewhere along the way, Claire had crossed that line. Then Elliot returned to the shipping records. The fentanyl still bothered me because the financial evidence explained why they might want my money, but it did not explain why a dangerous drug had been sent to my home. The shipping trail led to a medical logistics company where Ryan had previously worked and still had legitimate access credentials. Elliot compared inventory records with access logs. One shipment was short. The missing quantity was consistent with what investigators had found in the package sent to me. Then there was the security footage. It was not dramatic. There were no masks, no chase, and no secret meeting in a dark parking lot. The entire clip lasted 47 seconds. Elliot entered the warehouse after hours using his access badge. He walked to a storage area, removed a small container, carried it outside, and placed it in his vehicle. Then he left. I watched the footage twice. The second time, I stopped thinking about Ryan as the man married to my daughter. I was looking at someone who had physical access to the material that ended up inside a package bearing my name. I felt no need to cry. What hurt was seeing how ordinary it looked. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like a man finishing an errand. I finally understood how people get away with things. Sometimes the worst decisions do not arrive with warning signs. They arrive wearing familiar faces. I told Elliot that was the man my daughter had chosen over me. He corrected me quietly. "No, that's the man your daughter chose to believe." I knew what he meant. Claire had not personally walked into that warehouse. She had not taken the container. But she had chosen to believe Ryan's explanations, and she had started arranging my life around the consequences of his choices. Elliot gathered the documents and closed the folder. We had enough to begin building a serious case, but not enough to expose everything. There was still a missing piece. I asked what it was. He looked at me and said, "Their own words." And suddenly I understood what came next. We did not need to make them confess. We only needed to stop getting in the way of their mistakes.
The next morning, I met Elliot Grant at my house, and I stopped reacting to Claire and Ryan and started deciding what I would do next. Elliot and I reviewed my estate plan carefully. We did not make sudden transfers, move millions of dollars overnight, or create anything that would look suspicious if someone later examined the records. Everything had to be ordinary, documented, and legal. Fortunately, much of my financial life was already structured that way. I had a living trust. I had an LLC holding one of my properties. My retirement accounts had separate beneficiary designations, and some investments were already outside my everyday checking accounts. That mattered because the people around me were beginning to act as if everything I owned was sitting in one place waiting for someone else to take over. Elliot helped me review every part of it. We updated the person responsible for administering certain assets. We removed unnecessary access to accounts. We reviewed beneficiary designations and corrected the ones that no longer reflected what I wanted. For assets that had never been properly protected, we created a new trust under professional guidance. One commercial property was also sold, but it was not some frantic fire sale. The transaction had been considered before all of this happened, so we simply moved forward with it. The goal was not to hide money. The goal was to make sure nobody could quietly take control of it simply by convincing a court that I could no longer manage my own affairs. We deliberately left one old account untouched. It held $31,480. Claire knew that account existed. Compared with everything else I owned, it was small, but leaving it there gave me something important.
a piece of information Claire believed she understood. I did not tell her what had changed. Instead, I changed my behavior. I stopped arguing about small things. If Claire wanted to choose which doctor I saw, I let her make the suggestion. If she wanted to organize a routine appointment, I asked what she thought would be best. If she insisted that I should not worry about certain household matters, I thanked her. I was not pretending to be senile. I was simply refusing to fight every battle in front of people who were studying my reactions. The difference became obvious quickly. Claire became more confident. She started speaking for me more often. She began treating my silence as agreement. When I asked her what she thought I should do, she seemed relieved, as though I had finally accepted that she was the one making decisions. At one point, she looked at me and said, "Mom, you don't need to worry about money anymore." I smiled and answered, "That's good." She smiled too. I remember thinking that she had no idea what I had just changed. A few days later, Claire took me to see Dr. Helen Brooks. This was the appointment she had been preparing for since the package arrived. I knew what Claire wanted the appointment to accomplish, but I did not need to fight the examination. I answered every question clearly. I knew the date. I knew where I was. I knew why I was there. I understood my financial situation, my property, my accounts, and the decisions I had made with Elliot. When Dr. Brooks asked about my relationship with Claire, I did not accuse my daughter of trying to steal from me. I told the truth. I believed my daughter was worried about me. That was all. The appointment continued for more than an hour. There were memory questions, reasoning questions, recent events, and questions about whether I understood financial and medical decisions. I answered them. I did not exaggerate my abilities. I did not deliberately make myself look confused. I simply behaved like the woman I had always been. At the end of the evaluation, Dr. Brooks did not give Claire the conclusion she appeared to be expecting. Her written note stated that further independent evaluation would be required before any determination of incapacity could be made. That sentence was enough for me. There was no medical declaration that I could not manage my affairs, no convenient diagnosis for a judge, and no professional permission for Claire to control my finances. For the moment, that door was closed. But Claire and Ryan did not know that I had seen the disappointment on Claire's face, and they were not finished. That evening, I stayed in my bedroom while they talked downstairs. I was not trying to spy on them. I simply heard their voices through the floor. Ryan was frustrated. He said they didn't need me to look completely incompetent. They only needed enough uncertainty for a court to intervene temporarily. I stayed still. I did not go downstairs. I did not confront them. I had spent my career learning that one careless sentence could become evidence, and now I understood the same rule applied to the people trying to build a case against me. For the first time, I heard the plan in their own words. They were no longer talking about helping me. They were talking about controlling me, and that distinction was everything.
The next evening, Claire and Ryan came to my house carrying a folder thick enough to show they had prepared for this meeting. Inside were papers for a temporary conservatorship, financial management documents, and a power of attorney. They placed everything on my dining table as if they were asking me to sign routine bank paperwork. Ryan kept his voice calm. He said it was for my protection. I looked through the pages without signing anything. What struck me was how much authority the documents requested. They were not limited to medical decisions or ordinary household matters. They included access to investment accounts and language that could allow property to be sold. I asked why. Ryan gave me the kind of explanation people give when they have prepared an answer, but not for the question being asked. So I asked why a medical concern required control over my investment accounts. Then I asked why the paperwork included authority to sell property.
Claire became visibly uncomfortable. Until then, she had presented the arrangement as an act of love. She talked about reducing stress, making things easier, and protecting me from complicated financial decisions. But the documents were more specific than her words. The conversation became tense. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse either of them of stealing from me. I kept looking at the papers and asking what each section was supposed to accomplish. Then Claire made the mistake that changed the conversation. She said the properties had to be liquidated. The room went quiet. I looked at my daughter. She seemed immediately to realize that she had said more than she intended. I did not tell her what I was thinking. I did not threaten her. I did not tell her that Elliot already knew what was happening. I simply said, "I see." That was enough. There are moments when silence does more than an argument ever could. I had no reason to fill the silence for them. Ryan tried to bring the conversation back to my supposed health problems. He suggested that refusing to cooperate showed I was not thinking clearly. I looked at the documents again. By then, I understood what they wanted me to surrender. They wanted authority over financial accounts, the ability to manage or potentially liquidate property, and legal control before any court had determined that I lacked capacity. They were asking me to volunteer that control. I did not. I asked Ryan one final question about the estate. Why did my estate need to be liquidated before I was even dead? No one answered immediately. Claire looked down at the table. That was the first time she seemed unable to look directly at me. I had already made sure my financial protections were in place, but I had never told them exactly what Elliot and I had changed. The beneficiary designations had been reviewed, access had been tightened, assets needing additional protection had been placed under appropriate legal structures. They were still acting as if the old version of my estate plan was waiting for them. They didn't know it wasn't. Ryan became frustrated and asked whether I was refusing to cooperate. I did not argue. I told him I was asking questions about documents that would give other people control over my property. That was all. The meeting ended without my signature. After they left, I called Elliot. I told him what had happened, including Claire's statement about liquidating the properties. He reminded me that the strength of our evidence came from the surrounding records. We had kept communications and preserved documents I was legally entitled to possess. We had not accessed private devices, created evidence, or manipulated anyone into making a statement. Everything had to remain clean. The conversation could be documented and handled through the appropriate legal process under the laws that applied to us. Then Elliot gave me another piece of information. The warehouse evidence was stronger than we had first realized. The 47-second security video showing Ryan removing the container was only one part of the chain. There was an access log showing his badge entering the facility. There was an inventory discrepancy matching the missing inventory. There was a vehicle record placing the container in his car, and there was a timestamp connecting the shipping record to the missing inventory. Most importantly, the tracking information for the package sent to my Mother's Day table was connected to the same shipment chain as the missing inventory. The box on my Mother's Day table was no longer isolated evidence. It was connected to a sequence of records. For the first time, the financial scheme and the fentanyl began to look like parts of the same story. Later that night, Elliot called again. He told me we could take the evidence to federal investigators. I knew what that meant. Ryan could face serious consequences. Claire could be questioned about everything she had done, signed, and known. I sat alone in my kitchen after the call ended. For days, I had been trying to protect myself without destroying my family. Now the evidence was pointing in a direction I could no longer control. I asked Elliot what would happen to Claire. He was quiet for a moment. That silence told me he understood the question behind the question. I finally said, "That's what I'm afraid of."
The morning after Elliot told me that federal investigators could be involved, Claire came to my house alone. Ryan was not with her. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, and for a moment I saw the daughter I had known before the paperwork, the money, and the lies had entered the room between us. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and cried. She told me she had only wanted to keep our family safe. I asked her what she thought she was protecting us from. She said, from losing everything. I let that sit between us. Then I asked the question that mattered. Who had told her that we were going to lose everything? Claire did not answer. That silence stayed with me because I already knew the answer was probably not me. I went to the cabinet and brought out the folder containing my estate documents. I had not planned to show it to her, but after everything that had happened, I wanted her to understand one thing before the lawyers, investigators, and courts took over the story. I asked whether she knew what my will had said before that week. She shook her head. I opened the folder and showed her the relevant pages. Under the estate plan I had already created, Claire was not being cut out. She was not being left with some small amount after everyone else had taken their share. She was getting most of it. If I died under that plan, Claire would receive approximately $5.9 million, along with the house, designated investments, and other assets. I had also set aside money intended to support the education of my 2 grandchildren. That was the future I had been building quietly. Claire stared at the documents. She asked why I had never told her. I told her because it was never yours yet. She looked down at the pages and started crying again. I did not enjoy seeing her cry. I did not feel victorious. That was the part I wanted people to understand. I was not trying to win a fight over money. I was trying to understand how someone could be given a future and still decide they had to take it before the person who built it was gone. I told Claire that I had been building her future, while she had decided she needed to own it before I was gone. She did not argue. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then the front door opened. Ryan walked in. I had not invited him. He was angry, and it was obvious that Claire had told him enough to make him believe the situation was slipping away from them. He demanded that I sign the documents they had brought before. He talked about deadlines, creditors, and how complicated everything would become if I kept refusing to cooperate. I placed one statement on the table. It was from the old account Claire knew about. The balance was $31,480. Ryan looked at it and seemed almost relieved. Then he asked where the rest was. That question told me more than any confession could have. I explained that the rest of my assets had not disappeared. They had been protected through the structures Elliot and I had reviewed: the living trust, the property LLC, updated beneficiary designations, and an independent trustee for the assets that required additional oversight. My total estate was still worth roughly $7.8 million. The difference was that Ryan no longer had a path to control it simply because someone claimed I was incapable. He stared at the statement again. Then his anger broke through whatever restraint he had been trying to maintain. He said he had people waiting for that money. Claire turned toward him. She asked who he meant. Ryan stopped. He had finally said something that could not be explained away as concern for my health. Elliot had warned me that evidence mattered most when it connected separate parts of the story. Ryan's words connected the financial pressure to something outside our family. By then, Elliot had already begun providing the relevant records to investigators. The process was not instant, and nobody arrived at my door because of one call. Investigators had to verify the security footage, confirm the inventory discrepancy with the logistics company, examine the shipping records, and compare the financial transactions with the other evidence. Prosecutors reviewed the information before any major enforcement step was taken.
Only after the evidence had been independently checked could investigators seek the appropriate warrants. I knew none of this would be simple. I also knew once federal investigators became involved, I could not decide what happened next. That was the price of having the truth investigated properly. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard vehicles outside. I did not know exactly who had arrived. Claire looked toward the window. Ryan's face changed. For the first time all week, I was not the one pretending not to know what was happening.
The vehicles outside belonged to federal investigators. They did not storm the house or turn the moment into an action movie. They came with warrants, identified themselves, and explained why they were there. Ryan was taken into custody while investigators secured the evidence. He was facing federal charges involving narcotics trafficking, evidence tampering, and fraud-related conspiracy. I knew the difference between an accusation and a conviction. The court would decide what he had actually done. Claire was not arrested that morning. Investigators questioned her about her financial transactions, the documents she had signed, and the statements she had made about my health and estate. I looked at the investigators and said, "Treat her according to the evidence." I had spent days discovering things I never wanted to know about my daughter, but I did not want the law to become revenge. If Claire had broken the law, she needed to face it. When the investigators finished with Ryan, Claire came toward me crying. She apologized. I told her, "I believe you're sorry, but being sorry doesn't erase what you chose." I did not hug her or promise that everything would be fine. We could not immediately become the mother and daughter we had been. That was not punishment, it was a boundary. I also refused to use my money to make the consequences disappear. I did not pay Ryan's debts, withdraw my cooperation, or give Claire access to the assets she had tried to control. But I thought about my grandchildren. They had done nothing wrong, so I created an education trust for them completely separate from Claire and Ryan. Their future would be protected without giving either parent control of the money. 6 months later, I moved into a smaller house. My finances had survived, and my estate was intact. But that house carried too many memories. I also began helping older women recognize financial exploitation. I taught them to review beneficiaries, understand trusts, keep independent account access, and never sign financial documents simply because a relative says it is for their own good. I told them that love and financial control are not the same thing. Claire was still dealing with the legal consequences. Our relationship did not magically heal. There were no perfect family dinners and no apology that erased everything. Sometimes she sent me letters. One said she had thought she was protecting her children. I understood that fear had influenced her. Fear of debt, fear of losing stability, fear about her children's future. But fear did not excuse what she chose to do. I wrote back, "You were trying to protect them from fear, but you taught them that fear gives us permission to hurt people." I did not know whether she understood. Maybe she needed years. Maybe I did too. For most of my life, I thought being a good mother meant protecting the people I loved from every kind of pain. I understand now that love becomes unhealthy when protection turns into permission. Sometimes love means refusing to pay someone else's debts. Sometimes it means allowing the truth to reach the people who need it. And sometimes it means stepping back and letting another adult face the consequences of choices you did not make. One afternoon, one of my grandchildren handed me a card on the porch. It wasn't Mother's Day or my birthday. Inside were a few uneven words. "I love you, Grandma." I kept it. Then I took the old wooden box from the shelf. It had once held the papers that began the worst week of my life. Now it held only old photographs, letters Claire had written as a little girl, and pictures of my grandchildren. I closed the lid. For most of my life, I thought protecting my family meant making sure they never had to feel pain. I was wrong.
Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop protecting someone from the consequences of what they chose. My daughter tried to take my money, my home, and my dignity. She couldn't take the one thing I had spent 66 years learning: the ability to know when to stop being afraid.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in? And what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.